Hi there. So in this video, I'm going to take a few minutes to walk you through the second stage of the CAPE cycle called assess. Now, to be clear, what I'm going to be talking about is an annual assessment. When you and your team can take a deep dive on an annual basis and take a look at your organization and take a look at your overall strategy. Now, you should be assessing your organization constantly, really. Are we doing this well? Are we struggling with this? Are there some things in our environment that are changing? So that's just a strategic mindset that you have and analyzing things. But what this video is about is you pausing and really doing a little bit deeper dive on an annual basis to take a look at the overall organization and strategy. Now, there's two basic reasons for this step. The first reason is very straightforward. You want information and some data, and you're going to use that information and data to help you guide the creation of your plan and how you're going to execute it. But the second reason is maybe not as obvious, that this is a great way to engage your team. Your staff, your board, volunteers, potentially stakeholders, you can get their buy-in into the overall plan and process and organization. And there's a phrase there that people support what they help create. So if you do want people's buy-in, the engagement process is a great way to get them involved. And then also, of course, then it leads to a more comprehensive data set, both qualitative and quantitative data that can help you create that plan. Now, it's tough to know what the right amount of engagement is and how far you're going to go into asking everybody, and it varies from organization to organization. And you'll have to kind of do some trial and error to figure out exactly, we're going to ask everybody, or we're just going to ask a few people, whatever that process is. But these are two basic reasons why you want to do the assessment process, to get information and to engage people. Now, there isn't any one right way to do an annual assessment of your organization. You can look on the internet, you can read books. There's all sorts of ways that people propose for assessing the organization. What I'm going to share with you are some tools and a framework that we hope is really simple, easy to understand, that you can replicate and you can modify for your own use. And as you evolve in your own strategic planning process, you might have some other tools that you develop or whatever. But there's no one right way, but we're going to try to get you started with some basic assessment tools and a framework that might be something that you can sustain or you can replicate over time. Now, I want to give you, before we get into it, I want to share an important tip, and that, frankly, you should keep your assessment process fairly simple and quick. It's not unusual for people to want to do a super deep dive into the assessment. But we found that you can generally get a pretty good assessment and handle on things if you do things fairly quick and do a fairly simple assessment, especially because ideally you're going to be assessing over time also. You're not just going to do one assessment and that's it. You're going to assess, and then every quarter or so you're going to pause and take a look at how things are going. So your overall assessment is going to be continuing indefinitely. This idea of doing a fairly quick and simple analysis was backed up in this book called Blink by Malcolm Gladwell, and he shares this quote toward the beginning of the book, that we believe we're always better off gathering as much information as possible and spending as much time as possible in deliberation. So this is what I was just kind of saying, that it's easy we think we're always better off getting all the information we can. But what Gladwell shows in this book is that the first task of this book, Blink, is to convince you of a simple fact, that decisions made very quickly can be every bit as good as decisions made cautiously and deliberately. So, in any event, with your small organization, doing a quick assessment, finding out the main themes, and then creating some plan around that, and then continuing to revise your analysis over time is what we generally recommend, as opposed to doing a super, super deep dive into your small organization. If you're a much larger organization and that you have all sorts of moving parts, then a deeper analysis makes sense. But most of the organizations the planning process we're talking about are for smaller nonprofits that you need to look at your financials and look at your programs and look at your staffing, and there's just not as many significant moving parts that you would have as in a larger organization. So this concept of doing it rather quickly is a tip that we try to provide, and hopefully that will help your overall planning process work more effectively and efficiently. Now, I'm going to share with you here this concept of a two-part annual assessment. And this is the basic framework that we talk about. And you can replicate this across your organization, which I'll reference in just a moment. So basically, the idea is this, that you have a vision of where your organization is going to be in the future. And then you also have some understanding of where your organization is today. Your task in the strategic planning process is to put a planning process and execute it that bridges this gap. Your plan and your process of executing it takes you from where your organization is today to where your organization is going to be in the future. But you may be saying, well, I'm not really sure exactly where my organization should be or where we exactly are today. So that's why you have these two assessments. What we call part one is where you take a look at where your organization is today, and part two is your assessments. It's that straightforward. It's a really simple idea. So we're going to provide you with some tools that will help you to do that. But this model of where your organization is in the future and your organization is today, you can apply this to other elements of your organization. Let's say you're fundraising. Where do you want your organization to be, your fundraising to be in a couple of years? Where are you all today with your fundraising? What's your fundraising plan to get there? How about your board? Where do you want your board to be in a couple of years or 3 years? Where's your organization today? And then what's your plan where's your board today, and what's your plan for evolving your board to get to that point? This is a simple model that you can apply not only to your overall organization and strategic plan, but to different elements of the organization. Now, it does say your organization in the future. Typically, we say 3 years. You may want to go a little longer. You could go shorter for sure. But 3 years is a good starting place for doing a strategic plan, thinking about where your organization is going to be. Now, so I'm going to give you some details here in this graphic, and then we're going to walk you through and share some actual assessment tools. So this annual assessment has 3 inputs. This part one, your organization today, and these are some assessments and details that I'll share with you on the next slide. Part two, your organization in the future. And then you can also have optionally some stakeholder input. These part one and part two are for your staff and board. Arguably, you might involve some of your volunteers a little bit if they're really engaged in your organization. But the stakeholder input is something that's optional, and I'll share some details around that. But it's just, again, because there's no one right way to do that, you may or may not need to do a stakeholder assessment at this point. So in terms of part one, your organization today, these are the 4 components of that. An organizational bio, which is typically done by the executive director, and I'll give you an example of these in a moment, show you what they look like. What we call an organizational checkup, which is ideally for the full staff and board or board financials. We have an assessment we'll share with you on that. And then if you have an existing strategic plan, that's a great input. And then part two, your organization in the future. There's an assessment called an organizational vision assessment. So let me walk you through these, and you'll be able to have access to these assessments. So the organizational bio, real simple. Here's a template that you can use. And you can see here just some general information, documenting your mission and vision statements, clarifying an overview of your programs and metrics, very basic income questions, people questions, employees, contractors, board, etc., and some additional comments. So it couldn't be more simple. Just a 2-page document that gives you just a very high-level bio. And what's cool about this document, when you complete it, you can also share it with your staff and board members. And it's a really easy thing that you can do on an annual basis. The whole intention of this is that you're doing this annually. And that's why this is fairly simple. It's not a heavy lift, but you can do this on an annual basis and share with your team to keep everybody up to date on where we currently stand on some very high-level areas. Now, the second part of your organization today, so that would be part of your assessment of where you are today. There's also the organizational checkup. Now, this is something that you can share with your staff and board. So again, this is also intended to be conducted annually, fairly simple. General information here. And then we have this page here around ratings. So you can see all these different areas here that we ask you to assess. And then you have this ability to score from 1, absolutely not, up to 6, absolutely yes, or not applicable, or don't know, or doesn't exist. Anyhow, really simple. Go ahead and your team members can assess that. And then there's a SWOT analysis on page 3. Now, SWOT analysis is an assessment process that's been around, I think, since the 1960s. So it's old as dirt in the strategy world. And it's very simple. I've used this constantly with our customers. It works beautifully. It's an assessment of your internal strengths as an organization, your internal weaknesses, your internal opportunities, and your internal threats. And so SWOT is an acronym for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. It's very possible you've seen this before. But there are other question frameworks that are out there that sometimes people use. I think this works great. And the way that you ask this is you're asking people to address the top three, no more than three, but they can complete up to three. And then at the end of that, this is a question that I always like to add, which is really nice, is since they've done a SWOT assessment now and they're kind of cruising through the assessment and they have some insights, they can take a look at the priorities. So what specifically should your organization's top three priorities be over the next year? And so it's a real nice sort of synthesis question, and it's super helpful to you to know where your team stands about where the collective set of perspectives are around priorities. And then the final piece here is just any final thoughts that someone has. So those two documents, the bio and the checkup, are cornerstones of this overall assessment around where your organization is today. Now, we also have a financial review. It's very, very simple. It's a process review document, and it's just 7 questions here, and then some optional comments. But the idea here is for you as a small organization, just to make sure you have your financial processes in good shape. And this, like the other 2 assessments, can be done on an annual basis. But there's basic financial processes you're taking a look at. And as part of and financial processes are one of those things that we find over and over again some organizations struggle with to have dialed in. So that's why we highlight it here as a special content area. And then, of course, your existing strategic plan, if you have one, reviewing that, reviewing the goals, and so on. So those 4 pieces provide a nice framework for taking a look at your organization today. In terms of taking a look at your organization in the future, we have another assessment called an organizational vision assessment. It's simpler in that there's only 1 component as opposed to 4, but the questions are more interesting and maybe perhaps even a little more challenging. So what you're going to do is you complete this, and this can be for your staff and board, and ideally done on an annual basis also, is take a look at what we call different focus areas, programs and services, people, etc. Sorry about that. Focus area around fund development, operations, marketing, and strategic planning. And those are what we call these different focus areas. And there's 2 parts to each one of these areas. A, what's your 3-year vision? As specifically as possible, describe what you hope your organization's programs and services will look like in 3 years. And then actions, specifically what needs to happen to make your vision in the above row become a reality. So this concept of here's your vision, here's your actions are replicated for each of these. This would be about staffing and board of directors, fund development, and so on. So the idea here is that you, as a leader, and perhaps the other leaders of your organization, are getting feedback from your team about, hey, this is what our dream is for the organization in 3 years. And that combination then, going back to this slide, is you're getting clarity on a 3-year basis around where people hope the organization is, as well as what their perspective is on what some actions we could take to get there. And then you have this organizational assessment here around where your organization is today. You've got all the data you need to be able to create and get some guidance around where things are on what your strategy should be, as well as if you do the financial processes, you can get some insights around what people's perspectives are on the financial processes as a detail. So as part of that process, and this what people sometimes like to do a little bit deeper dive in, even though the organizational bio does reference some financials, you may want to look at your financials on a deeper basis too to help guide what your strategy is going to be. But this basic framework, though, is a great one and very simple, and you can repeat it. Here's where we are, here's where we want to go, let's create a plan to get there. Now, there's one other element that I'll just share, and I referenced it a little while ago around stakeholders. So if you want to do a deeper dive and get other people outside of your staff and board involved, then you can get to stakeholders. Now, stakeholders are typically some of your key funders or maybe some of those people that you serve, your key constituents. To get their input, our recommendation is to interview them. You can provide them with an online survey or something like that. You could do a focus group. You could get together and have it be a group, either virtually in a Zoom call or something, or in person. But the basic idea here is to have good conversations with them, develop your relationships with them, and really learn from them. So here are some questions you can share with them as you're interviewing them. What are 3 words that you'd use to describe our organization? What does our organization do well? What do we need to do better? How can we better meet your needs? A great question here. Are there any opportunities that we should be aware of? Is there anything else that we should know about that would help us with our strategy? So you have these different sort of basic questions that you could use as part of an interview. And so it's optional. It really depends on whether or not you want to spend the time and energy getting some of that feedback. But if you do, then now you have some additional feedback that you can input into both your assessment for where you are today, as well as where your organization can be in the future. And now you have a nice set of data that will form an overall annual assessment process that, using that data, getting the engaged team is going to set you up nicely for that third and next step here in the CAPE cycle, where you and your team are going to create a plan for your organization. So hopefully this is helpful, and this framework is something you can really utilize to conduct that annual assessment for your organization.